Okay, I would like to start. Excuse me. Thank you for joining us for our program, Living Through the End, Nuclear War in 1980s TV Movies. My name is Yuki Miyamoto, professor in the Department of Religious Studies and director of the DePaul Humanities Center. As we gather today, I would like to note that the year 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the detonation of the first atomic bomb in Alamogordo, New Mexico, as well as the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You may have seen the Academy Award-winning film Oppenheimer, which vividly portrays the inception of the atomic age and reminds us that we are still within it. While the film's cinematography powerfully captures the explosion's nearly mythical weapon and explores the psychological aftermath for Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Manhattan Project, it notably omits the long-term effects on the people of New Mexico as well as Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the time of the Trinity test, for example, approximately 13,000 residents lived within a 50-mile radius of the site. Many of them passed away rather prematurely from radiation-induced illnesses. Reflecting on the 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, on this 80th anniversary, offers us insight into how the potential damage to our lives, environment, and livelihoods was imagined, and how the anxiety surrounding nuclear annihilation was portrayed. We too are living in a tumultuous time as we revisit media representations from the 1980s. I cannot help but wonder whether these visual narratives will remain fictive or become prophetic. To explore this important topic, especially relevant on Earth Day today, we are joined by an excellent guest. Let me introduce today's moderator, Vicki Lesley, who is introducing our guest speakers. Vicki Lesley is a British documentary filmmaker and TV producer whose career spans over 25 years. During that time, she's developed and produced top-rated and award-winning TV documentaries for broadcasters in the UK and North America, including the BBC, History Channel, and National Geographic, as well as directing several independent short films which have screened at festivals around the world and online. Her debut feature documentary, The Atom, A Love Affair, had its UK cinema release in 2020 and has since sold to broadcasters around the world as well as Netflix and Disney Plus. While her most recent film as producer, The Narrow Dress, was released in 2023 and enjoyed a sell-out cinema run across the UK. She is currently developing a short film bringing together the global energy crisis with the impacts of chronic illness and hidden disability and writes regularly about life, films, and atomic culture on Substack. Without further ado, let us welcome Vicki Lesley.
Thanks, Yuki. And God, I'm so pleased to see so many people coming into the Zoom room. It's wonderful. And yeah, special day today, and yeah, a kind of significant year, isn't it? So it seems especially, well, yeah, timely, I guess, to all be gathered here to look back at these films, which suddenly feel like they're taking on a kind of whole new relevance 40 years on. So before I introduce our wonderful guest expert speakers, a little bit of housekeeping. We didn't, if you signed up already by Eventbrite, then we have already got your email address. But if you've just hopped in straight from the Zoom, but you'd like to get sent the recording and, you know, anything else we want to send you afterwards, then if you can just drop your email into the chat box, then we will have a record of that and then we can follow up with you. So yeah, I'm going to crack straight on. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Then we'll hopefully you will have had a chance to watch at least one, if not all of these movies. But in case you haven't, or even if you have, and just to sort of refresh your memory, we're going to, before we get into things, I'm just going to give you a quick little synopsis for each of the movies, and we've got the trailers lined up for you too. So before I do that, first of all, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Allison McCracken. Allison is an associate professor of American Studies at DePaul with a focus on popular culture, media studies, and 20th century US cultural history. She's the author of the book Real Men Don't Sing, Crooning in American Culture. Sounds brilliant. Which focuses on the cultural politics of crooning vocal performance in the first decades of the 20th century. In her more contemporary work, she's written on social media, and particularly the platform Tumblr, and is co-editor of the collection A Tumblr Book, Platforms and Cultures, which is available open access from Michigan University Press. And then we're also very happy to be joined by Min-Kyoo Kim. Min is a PhD candidate in film and screen studies at the University of Cambridge. His doctoral research explores visual representations of nuclear violence with a particular focus on how the victimhood of colonized and racialized populations are occluded or excluded from the archive. And his work on Chris Marker's experimental short La Jetée has recently been published in the journal Screen, and he's a forthcoming book chapter on the Terminator in the Paul Grave Gothic series. So two fantastic speakers. I'm really looking forward to their presentations. But before we get to that, let's play in the trailer. So first of all, we've got Testament. Hopefully the screen sharing is going to work for this, but bear with us. We've done a tech run, so it should all be okay. Yeah, I also can't hear anything. I was hoping that was just me. Anna, can we fix that?
I'm sorry, you can't hear?
Can't hear it, no, sorry.
Heck, okay, hold on.
The best laid plans.
Yeah.
Sound is our nemesis today.
All right, let's see. A moment here. Let's see if this fixes it. I'm almost there. Thank you for bearing with me here.
It was a day like any other.
Yes.
Televisions glowed, radios blared. Breakfasts were being served. Children were playing. Everything was as it should be. When suddenly, it could never be that way again.
Okay, so Testament is a 1983 American post-apocalyptic drama film. It's co-produced and directed by Lynn Lippman, written by John Sacret Young. It was based actually on a 1981 short story by Carol Amon called The Last Testament. It was actually originally produced for public television, but it was considered to be so good and received such acclaim that Paramount decided to pick it up for a limited theatrical release, which is the only one of these three films that was shown in cinemas. It tells the story of the fictional community of Hamlin, a very ordinary small suburban town near the San Francisco Bay Area, in the aftermath of a major nuclear exchange across the United States. The bomb doesn't actually strike Hamlin. The town suffers no physical damage from the bombs, but we see the residents forced to deal with the fallout, literal fallout, as well as gradual radiation poisoning and the drawn-out collapse of what's left of the world outside. The star of the film, Jane Alexander, was nominated in the Best Actress category at the Oscars that year. Okay. Next up, we've got The Day After. So if we could have that trailer, please. I've got no audio on that as well.
The president is presently in direct communication.
We Soviet tanks poison.
Current world intelligence situation, and you might pay particular note to the nuclear submarines off the east and west coast.
Having already captured NATO advanced positions.
Hey, any of you guys hear anything about an alert?
I really don't think either side wants to be the first to use a nuclear device.
It's not a question of who, but where. East Germany sealed off the borders to West Berlin. Closing all feasible West German access ports.
We
have a massive attack against the U.S. at this time. ICBMs. Over 300 missiles inbound now.
Either we fired first and they're going to try to hit what's left. But they fired first and we just got our missiles out of the ground in time.
Side.
The second takes you beyond imagining, beyond tomorrow, and into the day after.
Okay, so The Day After is a 1983 American TV movie written by Edward Hume, directed by Nicholas Meyer. The plot revolves around a fictional conflict between NATO and the Warsaw Pact over Germany that rapidly escalates into a full-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. The action concentrates on the residents of the city of Lawrence, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, as well as on several family farms close to some American missile silos. The cast features several household names, including Steve Guttenberg, Jason Robards, and John Lithgow. More than 100 million people watched the film when it first aired on ABC in November 1983, which equated to a pretty amazing 62% share of the viewing audience. And in 2009, it came in at number 16 in a list of the top 100 highest rated TV broadcasts in US history. The rest of the top 15 was almost entirely like Super Bowl. So it was a lot of people. And then last of all, I've just seen Lex in the chat. So finally, we'll come to Threads trailer, please. Oh, we've got no audio again, I'm sorry.
The United States government has been forced, reluctantly, to take action to safeguard and please our legitimate Western interests in the Middle East. We are confident that the Soviet Union will take note of our resolve and will desist from its present perilous course of action.
There is growing evidence overnight from scientists and observers in many countries that there have been 2 nuclear explosions in the Middle East.
Response to today's news of the outbreak of hostilities between vessels of the United States and Soviet navies.
The Ministry of Defense has announced it's sending more troops to Europe to reinforce the British commitment to NATO.
This time, they are playing with, at best, the destruction of life as we know it, and at worst, total annihilation. You cannot win a nuclear war.
everything ready for you and your family in case an air attack happens. When you hear the attack warning, you and your family must take cover at once. The most widespread danger is fallout.
Quite good. Attack warning. Is it for real? Attack warning's for bloody real. You can't just do a big
Okay. I don't know. I'm not completely sure if we're still having some technical difficulties there. I don't know whether we were only getting one channel, possibly. What I will do is I will send. I mean, these trailers are all available online, but I'll send them out again afterwards so you can watch the full. I think in all the cases we didn't actually have the audio for the detonation, which is in some ways it's more eerie just seeing the visuals. But anyway, Threads. Threads is a 1984 British nuclear war TV film written by Barry Hines and produced and directed by Mick Jackson, which, similarly to The Day After, centres on a nuclear exchange between the US and the Soviet Union. It depicts the effects of this on Britain and in particular on the northern city of Sheffield, with the plot centering on the two families of a young couple who we see in the early part of the film planning their wedding and expecting their first child together. The film graphically shows the medical, economic, social and environmental consequences of nuclear war and was the first on-screen depiction of a nuclear winter. It was nominated for 7 BAFTA awards in 1985 and won in 4 categories, including Best Single Drama. It's been called the most disturbing movie ever made, and the original transmission date became notorious in British broadcasting circles as the night that the country didn't sleep. And if you've seen it, you will know why. So those are the 3 films we're going to be talking about today. And so I'm going to throw over now to Allison, who's got a presentation for us looking at The Day After. So Allison, over to you.
Thank you. So Anna, are you going to share or am I sharing and just telling you, yes, you are? Okay, brilliant. Okay. We were having audio problems with my clips too, which I could hear fine, but for some reason, Zoom didn't want to actually translate. Okay, so I will get started. Thanks everybody for coming. I teach a lot of US cultural history, so I'm really excited to talk about this film today. I'm calling it The Day After, US Cultural History and Imagined Community, which I will explain. This is a People magazine promotion in November of 1983. So this is before the film came out. There's so much advanced publicity. There's so much coverage afterward. I mean, it really is an event television, as they call it. And so you can see that it's, again, trying to suggest a unity of people being affected. So next. Anna, can I do that or do you need to do it?
Did it just now? Are you not seeing the advance? Oh, hold on. Hold up. Just a second.
Okay, so just really broad context, but we are seeing the Cold War arms race heat up in the 70s, the US and USSR. So there's a growing consensus that war is not survivable. We see a lot of anti-nuclear movements grow in the 60s and 70s, all kinds of them. 1979 in the US, we have a disaster at 3 Mile Island, which is a nuclear reactor meltdown, increased concern regarding nuclear safety and calls on the government to address it. 1980, activist Randall Forsberg, shown here, calls for a nuclear freeze, which is a term that gets widely popularized. Voters approve resolutions again for a nuclear freeze in 275 cities, states, the US House, not the Senate, so it doesn't pass. 1980 to 1983, there are many, many polls, asking the temperature of the public regarding the nuclear freeze, regarding nuclear war. They repeatedly show public support for the freeze. People believe that nuclear war is a significant threat. In fact, in a couple of the polls, 50% of the people said that they would die by nuclear war, which is kind of amazing. But having grown up during this period, that's exactly what we thought. So policy disagreements and the poll responses are really ignored or downplayed, meaning what is the best way to actually deter nuclear war or to prevent it. And the left and the right have different ideas about that, but that's really not something that comes up in the polls. They don't analyze it. So 1980, we have Republican Ronald Reagan elected president. He cultivated a strongman cowboy persona. His neocon advisors speak of nuclear war during his early years as winnable, which freaks people out. In March of 1983, he famously calls the USSR the evil empire. And he also introduced the idea of SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, this whole idea that if missiles are coming, we can prevent them from coming, which there was no evidence for, and people called it Star Wars and made fun of him. And many thought he would start World War III. So that's kind of the playing ground that we're dealing with in 83 when the day after was shown. Next. There are also a lot of other media fictional film portrayals of this, both on film and television. The ones on film that were probably the biggest ones were Silkwood and War Games. Silkwood was kind of previewed before Day After, but really given its primary theatrical release afterward in December. What's interesting about these kind of films is that the nuclear aspects of the world become frameworks to examine other current social issues, right? So you want to talk about, women heroines or workers' rights, then this story about Karen Silkwood, who exposed and fought radioactive contamination in her workplace, right? War Games was about a teenager. If you haven't seen it, it was the 5th most popular film that year. It was about a kid who's 18 and he hacks into the government secret website so that he can play games. I actually think this might be the most prophetic film for the times that we are living in right now. But cybersecurity, hacking, the rise of computer nerd culture, Silicon Valley, it actually did result in government action on cybersecurity for the first time. Can you play it for me? This is a little bit from the trailer.
This computer company is coming out with these amazing new games in a couple of months, and I want to play those games. Wow. What? We got something.
He found the right code word to play the game.
We're in.
But it was the wrong computer.
Shall we play a game? I didn't ask you that.
How about mobile, thermal, nuclear war? Sorry. All right.
Okay, that's fine. You can stop it there. So he does, start a panic, and it actually does affect people. So going on.
Three headings for multiple impact.
Not of the clip. You can go on to the next slide. They just keep playing the game, and then he realizes it's really happening, and he gets upset about it, which I don't know what happened today, but he is. Next, so commercial television and the day after. So the idea of the imagined community by Benedict Anderson is, one of the big sort of nationalism theorists, and he examines and critiques nationalism through the way the media makes people feel part of a group, so kind of national unity. And this is what a lot of commercial television was about, especially these kinds of event television, like the day after. So really important that there were 3 networks at this time, 3 commercial networks, and then PBS, public access, and a couple of syndicated channels. So everybody watched the same shows. So we had, water cooler, what they call water cooler conversations afterward, where everyone in the workplace talked about the same shows. No cable, no streaming, right? So tremendous unity, which is why you get these huge ratings that that Vicki was talking about. You just can't get them now in the same way. Family viewing. So television was seen as the suburban nuclear family's favorite domestic appliance. People watch TV together. The patriarchal family, which I'm sure that others are going to mention, was the kind of both becomes the watchers and the watched. So a lot of these programs are also centered on these kinds of families and the impact on these kinds of families, right? So primetime TV is not yet considered art, which doesn't happen until The Sopranos in 1997. But there are cultural hierarchies at work. So all commercial TV always is a mix in the United States of education, morality, and entertainment in various aspects. The networks invested in these prestige products about important issues that would win awards. They wanted to win awards. They wanted prestige. They also were part of addressing the public mandate to provide these kinds of programs to some degree. The Day After entertained through high production values and personal stories to promote identification and mitigate institutional and social division and critique. So in a similar way that something like the prestige program Roots, which was a miniseries from a couple of years before, there were a lot of these in the years leading up, was about slavery, and it critiqued slavery and racism to a degree, but everything else was basically a replication of dominant ideological norms, because that's how things work. You kind of have one thing that you're able to critique. So The Day After offered a diverse group of people who united as a nation in shared fear without having to identify solutions or address the needs of particular groups. Right? They could just say, well, it's kind of like Independence Day from the 90s, right? Everybody's going to get together and they're going to be affected. They're going to try to deal with things together, but we don't have to actually deal with our individual issues or problems with the governor, for example. The Day After, again, I think that Vicki gave an introduction to it already. I think one of the perhaps most interesting part of this in terms of the show was apolitical in that it didn't say it was either the Soviet Union or the US that had started the particular nuclear conflagration. And again, trying to be very broad about that. But Nicholas Meyer, the director, was very much a liberal and anti-nuclear, and he actually he leaked the film before it was broadcast to a bunch of anti-nuclear activists who then had spread it around the country to various peace activists, and they watched it and they had town halls about it and they gave it to the press. So there was that happening at the same time. So that's one way in which we can see kind of political action in relationship to a film that doesn't have to do with necessarily the broadcast text. So again, aimed at a viewing audience, there was a ton of press at the beginning that said children should only be viewing this with parents and you need to talk about it afterwards. So that kind of thing. Next, Anna. So I wanted to provide a little bit of a contrast, and I'm going to be interested to see if if Vicki or other people have seen this, anybody else has seen this film, or Min. But there is another TV movie special event that was actually April 1983, the television drama of nuclear detonation in the US, specifically in Charleston, called Special Bulletin. It is on DVD. It's a War of the Worlds framework, basically. So it's about media broadcasters who find out that there is a nuclear device that some activists have, and they're threatening to put it off unless the government acts to destroy nuclear arms, various kinds of nuclear arms. And it ultimately results in the killing of the protesters by the government, and then the government tries to unman the nuclear bomb, and they're not able to do it. So it goes off, and it's about like a Hiroshima size. So it just devastates the whole city of Charleston. And it happens live on television because they continually want to show these things so that, they can get ratings, right? So you can play a little bit of the first one there, Anna. I don't want to take too much time with it, but it's really interesting.
I'm up to 5'6". Something seems to be going wrong. I don't know what it is, though. Steve, you and George, get out of there. I'm sorry, John. I couldn't hear your last question. No, things seem pretty calm here right now. There's not a...
It's like, no. Okay, so then they end up talking about what's happening, and ultimately, so the city of Charleston disappears, and they're like, well, the city of Charleston is gone, going on to other news. And it's very much, it was very much an award-winning show. It was very much an institutional critique over character identification, showed government weakness, mendacity, social division in the United States, media exploitation, and it won several major awards, which The Day After did not win any awards except for special effects. So I think that's worth noting that this was taken more seriously, but is rarely seen or discussed in comparison. Okay, going on.
To the next slide or the
Next slide. Yes, next slide. Sorry, next slide. I'm going to cut that. We don't have time. So, all right. So I wanted to give you an example of the way a TV show actually showed people watching The Day After. So you had this show called The Americans from the early 2000s. This is 2016, their fourth season, and it's about Russian spies living in America as Americans, and their best friends are FBI agents because of course they are. And so they do a wonderful sequence where they show family and community and across the American-Russian divide actually watching this show together. And I think it's notable that the Soviet Union did air the program in 1987 and Gorbachev watched it and was very impacted by it. So we do see this as a global program in that way. And we'll just play a little bit of it. Anna, I'm going to just stop you after, about a minute.
John Cole.
Oh.
Evening's ABC theater presentation of The Day After. I play a father in a...
You want me to advance it?
No, it's fine. I just wanted to let people know that is the actual preamble by one of the actors to the presentation, to the movie. And I don't know if people watch that or have seen that or remember it, but they are very much concerned again with children watching. You can keep going.
American family who experienced the catastrophic events of a full-scale nuclear war. Before the movie begins, we would like to caution parents about the graphic depiction of nuclear explosions and their devastating effects. The emotional impact of these scenes may be unusually disturbing, and we are therefore recommending that very young children not be permitted to watch. In homes where young people are watching, we'd like to suggest that the family watch together so that parents on hand to answer questions and discuss issues raised by the movie. In a moment, The Day After.
Okay, that's fine. You could stop it there and go on to the next slide. This is a great sequence. I left it up in case people want to get hold of it later. So Day After airs, as Vicki said, huge numbers, just unbelievable numbers. And there's this immediate discussion and reception. So one of the things that if you have an event television that you can do as a network is you can have your news programs cover it at length, so that we have, that kind of continuation of the show, but also legitimation of it, right, as an important event because you're having important people in the news talk about it. Now, it was really an extraordinary number of people. They had what's called a viewpoint segment on ABC News right afterward. It went on for an hour and 20 minutes with talking heads, and these talking heads were absolutely an incredible group of people, but very demographically similar, as we'll talk about. But it followed the film with a discussion of major politicians, and the current Secretary of State, George Shultz, actually talked about what happened in the movie. And he's the person who's in charge of basically these kinds of negotiations with the Russians. So they actually had them on television talking about it. So I'm going to just do the introduction of them because I think it's really interesting. So Anna, it's the top one there. Can you just play the top one there for a minute?
Whether, in other words, the vision that we've just seen is the future as it will be, or only as it may be. Is there still time? To discuss, and I do mean discuss, not debate, that and related questions tonight, we are joined here in Washington by a live audience and a distinguished panel of guests. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Elie Wiesel, philosopher, theologian, and author on the subject of the Holocaust. William F. Buckley, Jr., publisher of the National Review, author, and columnist. Carl Sagan, astronomer and author who most recently played a leading role in a major scientific study on the effects of nuclear war. Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor to President Ford, chairman of President Reagan's Bipartisan Commission on the MX missile. And former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who wrote in the current edition of Foreign Affairs that nuclear weapons are totally useless, except only to deter one's opponent from you.
Okay. So I wanted you to get a sense of those, and we'd bring in George Shultz as well. So they're using the fairness doctrine here, which means they have to present diverse views. Now, they do present diverse views, basically the right and left position, and Carl Sagan provides actual really interesting commentary in that second clip, which I won't show you, but if you want to look at it, he does discuss the nuclear winter, Vicki. So it's really, he goes on and says, you know, this is not survivable, and goes into all of this. But they all agree, nuclear war is terrible. It should never happen. It's really not a difficult debate. Nothing to worry about it. So they're just, you know, saying there are different, basically, policy positions in relationship to this. But I think it's really interesting to contrast that with the way that people on the street are interviewed about this and provide different points of view. Because, of course, with this group, there are no nuclear activists, right, or anti-nuclear activists. There are no people that are actually on the ground. They're all kind of these talking heads that have important jobs or politicians. So the ABS-C news affiliate in New York City, actually also interviews people. So if we could play a little bit of that, we're going to skip this Carl Sagan thing. If you want to watch it, it's there. Thank you, Anna.
700 people packed Riverside Church tonight to watch The Day After. Many said they came here because they were afraid to watch it alone. While the TV movie was being shown, the streets of New York were a lot less crowded than usual for a Sunday night. Even in the Times Square area, which is usually so crowded, these streets are relatively empty. And ticket sales at some movie theaters were off by as much as 50%. Why aren't you at home watching The Day After?
Well, I had commitments and I have to go out, that's why. But I really would like to see it. I'm at work and I'm on my lunch break right now, but my mother's home watching a movie right now.
Most bars in the city showed The Day After on their screens. Business at this bar dropped off by half.
This has been so hyped in the other areas of the media that people are just sticking home to watch it, and it's affecting us dramatically here.
I teach fourth grade at St. Anthony's in the Bronx, and I think that my children will want to discuss this tomorrow, and I want to make sure that I caught it.
You could have stayed home.
Well, I was out this evening, and I needed to find a place with a television, and this seemed the most appropriate.
Once the TV movie was over,
You can stop that. So what I love is the contrast of the people of color who are actually doing things in their lives that they need to do, and the fact that they're kind of being policed and there's this punitive nature, like you're not participating as you should in this a public obligation as good citizens to watch this show. So again, we get this contrast of we're thinking a lot about, you know, nuclear war, which is not something on the ground that these people are dealing with, and we're not talking about their issues, and we're actually sort of reprimanding them for not being more engaged and involved. Next slide, please. So I'm finishing up. This is the last one, I promise. So legacy, long-term impact. I mean, there's a lot to say here. There is a new book, if you're interested in the political aspects of it. It just came out last year. There's a lot of new research called Apocalypse Television. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's very interesting in terms of the kinds of material that's been released regarding the Cold War that he brings into it. Reagan, who was a former actor, was deeply impacted. He was depressed by the film. It did impact Cold War policy in pursuing greater arms deals and reductions. And it distracted, again, it stayed in the news for a long time and distracted from other kinds of things that were happening in the Reagan administration that were actually really had very deleterious aspects on people's lives, especially working class people, and with, you know, various kinds of deregulation. And so that's happening. Culturally, subjects report being more fearful of nuclear war, less likely to believe it could be survived. Policy positions, however, still shaped by community. So if you're in, you know, conservative area, you're in a liberal area, that's going to be your policy position. But again, everybody agrees that nuclear war is bad. Emotional impact is most strong and long lasting on like teenagers, young kids and teenagers. So Generation X, I put some quotations from the over there. And for me, it was the same way. I mean, everybody watched it. I remember watching it. It has had a pretty big impact. I also watched Testament because I was a PBS watcher. So television, one of the last ratings blockbusters. Viewing communities fragment after this. We have more diversity of views and offerings in television after this, with cable, streaming video, et cetera, but less shared content as a result. So we don't have this kind of national audience in the same way. And I should say it's important, I think, that we also get more corporatization after 1996, the Telecommunications Act, that allowed, like one station to buy all the newspapers or to run all the stations. So we get more corporations, but we get more variety of content. There is noticeably less foreign coverage by news organizations after 1987 for various reasons, some of which have to do with funding, some of which have to do with the changing emphasis of the Reagan administration. Again, we have to think about the way that the government decides what's important. So basically they moved to like true crime and crime and true crime, and constantly reporting that. And it's cheaper for the networks than doing foreign bureau. They almost all, cut their foreign bureaus. They stopped talking about us as global citizens in the same way and providing us with that news. So we actually have the era of globalization. We actually have less global news in the United States. So there is quite a switch, I think, from that idea of the day after, where we're kind of more aware of what's going on. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, it's so fascinating. I mean, obviously, I'm British, so I wasn't in the US, and I was 7 years old. So I imagine my mum and dad would not have let me watch it. But yeah, it's kind of amazing. Those Vox Pops were really great to see, weren't they? There's sometimes that disconnect between the thing that all the kind of, the elites, the media and political elites are talking about versus just, people going about living their lives. But anyway, we will pick all this up. So I'm going to hand over now to Min, and he's got a really great presentation that is looking much more at threads and testaments. So over to you, Min.
Thank you. Can everybody see the screen okay? Just give me a thumbs up and then I'll know. Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Firstly, thank you so much to the DePaul Humanities Center for the invitation. This has been so wonderful to organize and so wonderful to see so many people attending as well. And I look forward to the discussion after this presentation as well. So today I'll be presenting Living Through the End, A Mother's Labor in the Nuclear Apocalypse of Testament and Threads. So whether through the astonishing, astounding box office success of Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, or the enduring popularity of Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, which has recently enjoyed its debut on London's West End, starring Steve Coogan, the spectre of nuclear apocalypse is haunting our contemporary culture. But past all present, these works tend to foreground the agency of men in laboratories, the Oval Office, or the War Room, who bear responsibility for either precipitating the nuclear apocalypse or saving us from the brink. It was kind of notable, Allison, in your presentation earlier of the ABC special bulletin, and just a series of white men discussing from the left and the right. And so that's the diversity of views. So rarely in such films or these works do these characters actually inhabit the potential aftermath of nuclear conflict. And this informs the title of our event today, namely on Living Through the End. Therefore, my presentation attends to two largely overlooked films produced for television, Lynn Lippman's Testament and Mick Jackson's Threads. Imagining the destruction of the very same domestic spaces that they were broadcast into, these films situate themselves in the frame of the disintegrating nuclear family unit. More specifically, I contend that focusing on the role of motherhood in both films can guide us, however tentatively, past the event horizon of the apocalypse and into the realm of the unthinkable. In so doing, Testament and Threads illustrate what I ultimately argue to be the true horror of nuclear apocalypse, not just the prospect of mass and indiscriminate death, but actually living amid the potential destruction of the archive and of memory itself. And this argument, which drives my PhD, is informed by Jacques Derrida's nuclear criticism, but if anyone interested, I'd be happy to expand on this in the discussion afterwards. So moving on to Testament, Lynn Lippman had a very distinguished career as a documentary filmmaker prior to reading Carol Amon's short story, The Last Testament, in an issue of Miss Magazine. Carol Amon's original story is structured as an epistolary of an unnamed mother's diary entries during the nuclear apocalypse, and I've just picked out a few excerpts here. In adapting this short story, Lippman cast Jane Alexander, who, as Vicki mentioned, was nominated for an Oscar in the role, to star as the protagonist Carol, the matriarch of the Weatherly family, living in the fictional suburb of Hamlin, California. The role spoke quite personally to Alexander, who was herself a mother and also a member of Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, or WAND. Testament begins with Alexander's Carol waking up, tidying the house, and preparing breakfast for her 3 children, Brad, Mary Liz, and Scotty. Meanwhile, her husband Tom goes for a cycle ride around Hamlin, and commenting wryly on this sort of gender division of labor in the household, Alexander later remarked tongue-in-cheek that Testament was a film all about sheets. She continued in more earnest fashion that the film relayed, quote, a woman's understanding about what we deal with on a daily basis. But this day-to-day schedule of the Weatherly suburban life is soon interrupted. An emergency broadcast on the TV announces a series of nuclear attacks in the US, and then blinding white lights stream into the Weatherly's living room. Although there is no visible destruction in Hamlin, there is a prevailing and foreboding sense of isolation as the electromagnetic pulses of the distant nuclear explosions have excommunicated the town from the rest of the country. Disconnected from the main line, Carol is unable to contact Tom, who had commuted into San Francisco for work. In this desolation, the only media technology that survives is Carol's journal, providing another dimension to Alexander's earlier comment that the film was all about, quote, sheets. The first morning after the nuclear attack, a panning shot of the Weatherly's kitchen table scans across the deadened instruments of the family's TV, the turntable, and the radio, before eventually settling on Carol's hand, writing in her journal. February 24th, she notes, I'm so afraid. Carol's worst fears are realized when the imperceptible violence of nuclear apocalypse, that of radioactive fallout, invades the Weatherly's home. At first, Carol's morning routine appears identical as she makes breakfast and gets the children down to sort of sit at the breakfast table, and she records in her journal that nothing seems real, everything looks the same. But this facade of normality fades, with Scotty, the youngest child, complaining of the funny taste of the milk. The vulnerability of children in particular is analogized through the local school's theatrical staging of the Pied Piper of Hamlin, an event that marks the community's effort to live life as normal. However, the morbid symbolism of the performance dissipates any notion of normality, as the story of the Piper's music, which empties the fabled town of its children, foreshadows the radioactive fallout that will eventually also claim the lives of the young in the Hamlin of Testament. And you get the sort of the pun on the double name there, Hamlin, Hamlin. The tears of the parents that you see here in the audience appear to acknowledge that soon their own children would disappear. So at this point, it's not about whether the children will survive, it's a question of when they will disappear. And at this juncture, I want to draw attention to Alex's aforementioned remark, the Testament was a film all about sheets again. In a visceral encounter with the corporeal effects of radioactive fallout, Carol uses bathroom towels to clean Scotty's limp body of the blood from his hemorrhoids. Carol then wraps Scotty in blankets and cradles the lifeless boy to sleep. This defamiliarization of household items continues to unfold when Carol repurposes the children's bed sheets to sew together burial shrouds, first for Scotty, then later for Mary Liz. Wrapped in their own bed sheets and buried in their backyard at home, Carol affords Scotty and Mary Liz a certain degree of individuality in death. And although this is not shown explicitly in the film, Eamon's original story involves Carol recording the exact date and time of a children's death, indexing them in a sort of a wider social and, well, indexing them in sort of a personal journal, but then a wider social memory. Meanwhile, the rest of the decimated town of Hamlin resorts to burning bodies wrapped in anonymous plastic bags on mass funeral pyres. So against this backdrop, the bespoke sheets of the children's burial shrouds and the pages of Carol's journal mark a mother's labor to preserve an archive in the face of the apocalypse. But it's not just the sheets of Carol's journal, but the screen of Lippman's film itself that conveys this desire to remember loved ones, to sort of preserve an archive. Throughout Testament, we have these kind of very interesting interweaving of the cinematography with home video footage of the Weatherlys from before the apocalypse, such as Scotty cycling or Carol dancing with her children. Regardless of the sort of the precise mechanics of how we get these home video footage shots, because there's no, like, we have no access to the TV or electricity is out, Lippman's kind of delving into this fictionalized yet grainy audiovisual archive reifies the textured reality of a family that did once live beyond the frames of Testament's diegesis, beyond the purview of the cinematic audience. So both Carol's journal and Lippman's film become poignant documents of peacetime, of those once loved and now lost. Consigned to their inevitable fate, Carol, Brad, and Hiroshi, a boy adopted from their neighbors, contemplate suicide by enclosing themselves in the garage and running the car's engine. Right at the last moment, though, the deus ex machina of home video footage of Carol playing with Brad in the garden appears to deter them from realizing their plan. Carol turns the car engine off, and through a match cut, she lights candles and crackers to celebrate Brad's birthday. When Brad asks what he should wish for, Carol echoes the words of Eamon's original short story, quote, that we remember it all, the good and the awful, the way we finally lived, that we never gave up. Carol thus signals the resilience of it, not just to live or to survive, but to remember. As Carol, Brad, and Hiroshi blow out their candles, the film cuts once more to home video footage, and we see the family reunited at Tom's birthday. Therefore, I argue that the film concludes that what makes life livable, what makes us human beyond the mere biological fact of survival, is the stability of the archive of our memories, both happy and of rituals of both birthdays and indeed funerals. What confronts us in the nuclear apocalypse, I would sort of posit, is not just death, but the complete erasure of our existence, of the sort of extinction of our memories. And this is what Carol's role as a mother in Testament, as a guardian of the archive, labors against. Moving on to Threads then, and like Lippman, Mick Jackson was also experienced as a documentary filmmaker. He eventually approached the novelist Barry Hines to produce the screenplay for what became Threads. I just want to introduce a bit of material on Barry Hines here, because I think his input is often overlooked with a sort of the focus on the director or the auteur. But Hines had previously authored a book called Kestrel for a Knave, which he then adapted into a screenplay for Ken Loach's Kes. And anyone, particularly in Britain, will know sort of what a special and sort of important film this is in the British imaginary. Jackson and Hines's shared desire to sort of envision the apocalypse from the perspective of normal everyday life informed Threads' setting in Sheffield, a city situated, as Jackson auspiciously put it, quote, bang in the middle of Britain. Sheffield also had symbolic value, as its Labour-led council had declared the city a nuclear-free zone in solidarity with the National Labour Party's policy of unilateral disarmament. Threads follows the story of a young couple, Ruth and Jimmy. Ruth discovers that she is pregnant just as tensions abroad spark fears of a nuclear Third World War, prompting widespread panic and indeed political protest. Similarly, also to Carol's journal, we have a narrator, and there's a teletype of Threads, which kind of provides us a narration and timeline of events. One morning, the nuclear conflict begins. Jimmy, who had started the day at work in his joinery, sprints through a disintegrating Sheffield in a desperate attempt to get home. This is the last we see of Jimmy. Ruth, who takes cover in her parents' basement, wanders around the subsequent ruins of Sheffield in a hopeless search for Jimmy. But in this ghoulish wasteland, the only trace of her familiar life before the apocalypse that Ruth can find is Jimmy's handbook of foreign birds. Ruth's decision to preserve this book, just as Carol keeps her own journal, signposts her desire to remember the past and to commemorate her fiancé, especially as Threads follows Testament in drawing attention to the anonymity of mass deaths that arise in the aftermath of the nuclear attacks, with a teletype eventually announcing, quote, unburied corpses in the UK, estimated 10 to 20 million. In fact, we see that Threads invests a significant amount of spectatorial attachment to Jimmy's handbook of foreign birds, which Ruth recovers in the aftermath of the nuclear attack. Ahead of the nuclear conflict, we see how birds bring out this kind of childlike enthusiasm in Jimmy. Moreover, Jimmy's upkeep of an aviary in his back garden evokes a specific cultural valence in the context of Thatcherite Britain. Indeed, the aviary recurs throughout Heinz's work as rare sites of nature and nurture away from the socioeconomic hardships and turmoil of working class life in the north of England. So within Heinz's imaginary of the North, it therefore becomes possible to imagine Jimmy here as the grown-up Billy from Kes, a precocious character whose bond with his kestrel in the north of England iconize the arduousness of growing up in the sort of the post-industrial in post-industrial Britain. Ruth's preservation of the Handbook of Foreign Birds into the apocalypse, therefore, doesn't just protect her memory of Jimmy, her fiancé, but also a wider symbol of resilient British working class culture in the North in the face of an existential threat both within Threads and from the real-life consequences of Thatcher's neoliberal revolution. With the complete and utter collapse of all public institutions, Ruth is left all alone to deliver her baby Jane in a barn. We get this kind of pastiche of the nativity scene as the teletype announces that this is actually the 25th of December. So while the Weatherlys and Testament persist in marking Brad's birthday, the complete silence of this particular Christmas night in Threads does not celebrate the birth of any child, but instead symptomatizes the sheer austerity of language after the nuclear attacks. And this graver tone of Threads may again relate to its filmmaker's politics, with the desolation of language and culture in the film's mute depiction of apocalypse, perhaps allegorizing Thatcher's infamous shibboleth that, quote, "there is no such thing as society." But even within this state of anarchy, even within this nuclear winter that Carl Sagan spoke about, Ruth preserves Jimmy's Handbook of Foreign Birds, something that has no economic value, but is of important psychological value for her. But eventually, the prolonged exposure to radiation and sheer exhaustion from hard labor commits Ruth to her deathbed. Shorn of any sentimentality, Jane, now a teenager, urges her mother with the words, "Ruth, work, work, up, up." It's as though even the bonds of family have disintegrated completely, with bodies relating to each other solely as vessels of labor. Ruth dies, too weak to say goodbye, and Jane promptly salvages her mother's possessions and sets out alone into the wasteland. A close-up shot under Ruth's pillow reveals that Jane has left behind her father's Handbook of Foreign Birds. So while we in the audience recognize the value of the handbook, Jane, a child of the apocalypse who has never learned to read or write, discards this item. Leaving this rare artifact of the peacetime archive behind, Jane effectively extinguishes the memory of her parents, Ruth and Jimmy. In the final moments of Threads, Jane is sexually assaulted and becomes pregnant. As Jane herself becomes a mother, and we see and she sees her baby for the first time, her face contorts into an expression of abject horror. The film ends on a freeze frame of this image, which denies the viewer the conventional cinematic grammar of the shot reverse shot. Not only are the characters of Threads mute in this apocalypse, without any words and without any books, but it's as though the language of film itself unravels. We are simply left to wonder what this unsignified or perhaps unrepresentable face of the future looks like. Threads concludes only by beckoning towards a subject that awaits at the end of civilization, at the limit of the archive. The descent into apocalypse, then, is not by the thwarted biological reproduction of the species, but instead the end of referentiality, not the end of humans per se, but the effacement of culture, the extinguishing of language, and the extinction of memory. I know that my time is running out, so I'll conclude with a very brief sort of reflection, which is that at the time of the broadcast of Threads in 1984, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set the doomsday clock to 3 minutes to midnight, the closest it's ever been at that time to the symbolic hour of apocalypse. Today, though, the same clock stands at the unprecedented precipice of 89 seconds to midnight. But I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that action is more urgent than ever. But my kind of addition would be to encourage us all to reflect exactly on what midnight truly means. Often facing catastrophe, we like to think about the future, of generations to come, of leaving behind a legacy for those unborn. But the nuclear apocalypse, in the thousands of weapons tests and various accidents in civil nuclear power, is already the past and present for people around the world, people whose names and images we have forgotten or perhaps just ignored. Therefore, and with the help of films like Testament and Threads, and observing the labor of Carol and Ruth, who endeavored to protect the memories of their loved ones and people around them, I want to emphasize the importance of the past when discussing the nuclear apocalypse. This might just illuminate how we best preserve our humanity in the days ahead and indeed after. Thank you.
Thank you, Min. Well, take a moment to just feel very depressed to thinking about the end of Threads. So we've got about 30 minutes left, and I imagine that there'll be lots of comments and questions for Allison and Min. So I thought maybe I'll just sort of kick us off, and then if hopefully if people are happy to do this, if you're comfortable to turn your camera on and unmute to ask the question, but if you can pop the questions or comments into the chat box first, and then we'll see what's coming in, and we might get some overlaps and we can group them together, but we'll see how we go. We've got about half an hour time left together, so there's so many things to pick up, it's hard to know where to start really, but I guess a good place to start really is just to compare those three films, and we've got into it a little bit, both of you in your presentations there, but there's lots of different ways to look at the comparison between those three films. But I think maybe picking up on the end of Min's presentation there about sort of the time scales. One of the many things about those three films is the sort of window of time that we see. I mean, Testament, it's not clear, but it's some weeks, I guess. It's some time afterwards. The day after feels quite brief. Again, it's a bit ambivalent. Obviously, the thing that's really distinctive about Threads is, and so devastating, is that it goes on, and you think this is the worst thing that could have ever have happened, but then it carries on. I mean, at the end, the loss of language, the loss of life, as in any, that there are still human beings alive, but then they're sort of almost like not recognizable as humans in our civilization. And actually, I don't know if everybody has seen this news, but it's just been announced, I think last week or the week before, that there's going to be a remake of Threads, which is very interesting propositions. We have talked about, in preparing for today, we've talked about perhaps why. I mean, obviously, Min referenced a few things there. Oppenheimer, there's the Doctor Strangelove remake, and again another remake. There are some things being made, but considering how the situation that we find ourselves in currently, the doomsday clock kind of indicating just how serious things are, and probably getting even more serious with every day that goes by, it seems. It's quite striking how the culture is perhaps hasn't been responding in the same way that it was doing in the 80s. And the remake of Threads is very interesting, but it's going to be, I don't know if everyone's seen the sort of big phenomenon on Netflix that's just happened, Adolescence. It's the same team who've made this who are going to be remaking Threads. And one of the things that was striking to me in their press release was there was a comment, something to the effect of how, I think that they referenced the pandemic, that we've kind of, this idea of like finding hope and community even in the most difficult and dangerous of times, which seems to me that perhaps they've misunderstood, they've misread Threads quite profoundly, because there is just no hope. But I should stop talking because I'm waffling on. But yeah, if you guys wanted to pick up something on that sort of time scale, and then if we can just start getting some questions in, and I'll try to throw things in as they come in. Allison, Min, whoever wants to pick that up. Oh, you
wanted us to talk about it. Okay.
Yeah,
I just wasn't sure.
Reflections.
Well, I kind of did, in terms of, I hadn't seen Threads before. So it was really
interesting.
No, it was really new to me. So yeah, and very interesting to see that kind of difference in the time frame, and that it went on, 13 years into nuclear winter. I did think, this, for me, in terms of genre, we've talked about Day After being more of a disaster film. And I think it is up until the midpoint where it's a disaster, but then the people who survive really don't survive, or they're not going to survive for long. So it's pretty bleak at the end. But when I watched Threads, I thought, well, this is horror straight up. This is what the genre is. And part of that is, who are the monsters? The monsters are now the people who, are, not, as you're saying, like broken with civilization, but then it also really made me think about, well, civilization did this in the first place. So, we caused this, right? So even to say they're not civilized is like, well, is civilized a good thing to be? And so, like I thought, well, Jane communicates differently, but I don't see that as necessarily a problem, except that she's, poor and hungry and clearly overworked. And so, for me, I was looking at it from that perspective and to say, well, she doesn't have language or culture, but a lot of people don't. And, the British Empire didn't do a lot to help people in those respects, right? So I read it very differently and thinking about it in terms of disability as well, and saying, well, we see a lot of a way in which they're disabled in the way that we think about ability and the way that we think about civilization. So I wasn't as devastated by it because I felt like it's making me see this within a horror genre, and I'm kind of resisting what it's doing. So I was really interested. I just wanted to share that. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I don't think I've thought of it as a sort of horror genre. Min, do you have any thoughts on that? You're our film expert, another film expert.
No, there's so many like fruitful avenues, but it's sort of, and time is obviously such a big consideration. I am just sort of curious about like the fact that these three films come out within like a year and a half of each other, and across the Atlantic as well, of course. So like there's a kind of a shared urgent, and kind of there's, I guess this kind of brings in more of my own sort of current PhD research into the question, but all these films are talking about the future, of course, in the way that the Doomsday Clock sort of suspends apocalypse to the future in ways that make it very easy for British and American populations to overlook the testing that Britain and America has conducted and was conducting right up until the 80s. Of course, like atmospheric tests ended in the 60s, but people are living still now with those consequences, right? So time is not, whilst kind of these films bring people together in one event, which is something we don't really see anymore. That's kind of like a throwback as well, people all watching TV at the same time. There's also kind of a variegated conception of time, right? Not everyone experiences 1984 in the same way. And I think whenever we talk about these films, it's always important to sort of consider the hermetically sealed Anglo-American special relationship, which of course is so reliant upon victimizing othered populations. So yeah, I think sort of I'll bring in the question of space with the dimension of time as well.
So I've got a question here. Oh yeah, following up on Min, you mentioned about Derrida and the nuclear criticism. Would you like to expand a little bit on that? And please, guys, do. I feel like people are being a bit shy, but please do put your questions in. We've got two great speakers here.
Thank you, Anna, for the question. I'm developing, like, the PhD is basically sort of centered around this kind of relationship between the archive and the apocalypse, and it's informed by, I think, a fairly ill-known article from 1984, actually at the same time as Threads and all these films, written by Derrida called No Apocalypse, Not Now, which I referenced in my presentation, where he sort of takes this move to define nuclear apocalypse not as the end of human species or the end of human reproduction, but the remainderless destruction of the archive, as he calls it. And I find that a very kind of compelling framework to work with, because it's not the idea that humans won't survive, it's that we won't have any capacity to signify what we see and what we experience, that we won't have any tools to remember those who have died and to sort of pass on knowledge. So the biological fact of the human species might persist, but it won't be a life worth living. Again, I think I want to bring in a critique of Derrida as well. So whilst I find his framework very useful, he also says very conveniently that there has been no nuclear war. And he even goes so far as to say in this article that Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't proper nuclear wars. I don't really know by what metric he judges what a nuclear war is or not. Because I would say that, again, the atomic flashes at Hiroshima and Nagasaki are kind of, we're drawn to the spectacle precisely because we can't see it. Like there is no container, I believe, no visual container that can possibly show that flash of light. So it's kind of yeah, it's odd that he wouldn't apply this idea of remainderless destruction to what has already happened, and why he chooses to suspend it for a future. But that is kind of the role that Derrida plays in the thesis. But again, I'll be very happy to discuss it further beyond the presentation.
Especially in terms of the critique.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm wondering if we've got a bit of a technical thing here, because I'm not getting anything in the chat. Are you guys able to raise your hand? Oh, here we go. I'm sorry. Just as I said that, something's popped in. Grace, would you be happy to come on camera and ask your question? This is a question about class, which is super interesting.
I'm not sure that my camera actually works on my laptop, but can everyone...
You're clearly from this side of the pond.
I didn't think I'd be able to say much without people noticing that. Yeah, so I'm from like next door to Sheffield, and I just found it really interesting what Min was saying about like the extinction of memory, and something that I think a lot about is like the way that working class culture is captured in film and the way that a lot of working class culture is overlooked. I think there's a lot of stuff around class where there's like iconic bits of culture that maybe aren't read by other people. And I thought that like the recognition of Kes and the birds and the way that that were like pulled through were really interesting. And I just wondered if there were else that kind of stuck out in relation to working class culture that Min wanted to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Grace, so much for the question. It's this dimension of space that I'm talking about as well, right? We talk about these monolithic terms of Britain and America, but we of course know that the RAF bases aren't slap bang in the middle of London. They're around what we would call peripheral areas, or areas that are considered peripheral to the interests of Westminster. I would love to hear more, maybe in the day after's case, kind of like what the sort of the imaginary of the rural sort of, is it Ohio where the military silos are sort of located? Yeah, like kind of the class politics of where the missile silos are located in the American context as well, because I wouldn't imagine that they're in sort of downtown Brooklyn or whatever. So there is, of course, class permeating through every consideration of the nuclear. These are the consequences are always hoisted upon those populations that are considered disposable, and that is, of course, as sort of ethnically or racially motivated as it is by class politics. So I believe that is such an important consideration to always to have in mind. One thing that I haven't completely worked through with my work is I know that Mick Jackson and Barry Hines had quite close relationship in their making of the film. So I don't quite know kind of like which bits how Hines sort of got to have his own way, or if Jackson sort of like yeah, I think like sort of spoke over him quite a lot. But the Barry Hines archives are opening up, so watch this space.
Does anybody else like to turn the cameras on and come on and ask us something? Whereas I can carry on then. The other thing I guess that's sort of come out a little bit is I guess it's a sort of that we've got two American films and a British film, and Testament I think falls somewhere in the middle maybe. But the day after, I mean, I think Mick Jackson was quite explicit when he found out that the day after was coming. He was already had started production on Threads. And he was like, oh, no, there's no point us doing it. Then he watched the day after and felt that it just did not show the full horror of actual nuclear war. And it was too much, like it had too many tropes of just your classic disaster movie, you know, Independence Day and all of the kind of, you know, America Saves the World movies. And I think that's a bit harsh, I hadn't seen the day after when I read what Mick Jackson had to say about it. And I think it is still very bleak. But there is more of a feeling of heroism, I think, especially the doctor character. I mean, the hospital, there's a absolutely devastatingly appalling scenes in the hospital in Threads. it's just beyond. It's just that is horror, as you say, Alison. The hospital in the day after still seems to be sort of somewhat functional, and I don't know if there's something kind of we can pull on in the kind of the cultural, especially in the 80s. You know, Britain and Sheffield was a working class northern city that was going through a great recession. We had around the same time as the miners' strikes. None of this stuff is really explicit. Exactly. I mean, we've got you sort of, I guess you see the demonstrations. There is that backdrop is clearly there and would have definitely been there for the audience that was watching it on the BBC in 1984. So if there's, you know, anything to say about, I guess, British versus American culture around the way these films were, you know,
Well, I would just say, and I think that's a really great point to make, because British films, class is always visible. It's always emphasized. It's always there. People know. The first time I went to Britain, they actually classed me. Like someone said, this is who you are. You know, this is the class you're in. And I'm like, I'm 20. Where are you getting this from? But it was interesting, right? So class is always very visible, very conscious. It's not that way in the US. The mass media doesn't really talk about class in a conscious way, even if they represent it. We're much more likely to talk about racial difference, for example, racial tensions, than we are about class tensions, even though we really needed to. And the 80s was also a period of, you know, recession. It's not like Americans weren't going through that. And I think part of the problem with American culture is not recognizing that, and that is part why we are where we are. Is to not acknowledge that. So I really liked that aspect of it. It really seemed grounded in working class culture of Sheffield, and I really always appreciate that about British films. And I think Americans are always like, it's set in the heartland. It's set in the Midwest, in the, you know, the good farmer. I'm like, is the good farmer good when his farms are being destroyed by corporatization and, you know, like being taken over by these massive companies during this period? No, you don't really get any of that, right? It is this kind of ideal, a pastoral ideal that you're getting. So yeah, I think really interesting contrast there.
Possibly as well, just you saying that, you know, the day after is on ABC. It's on a commercial network station, and you mentioned it was really interesting you talking about the different things that the network TVs were doing at the moment, but at that time, but one of them was trying to get, you know, awards. The BBC obviously has this public service remit, and Threads was very much seen as part of that. And I mean, as you showed those great clips from the discussion with all those you know, eminent white men, there were similar things that the BBC transmitted afterwards, also basically with a load of white men. There were a few women, but yeah, that maybe that's also. I wonder if that's also part of those differences. I don't know. Men, do you want to chip in on that? The British versus American difference?
No, I think someone has a hand up.
Stephen's got his hand up. So Stephen, you yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Sondheim. I live in Chicago. I'm part of the Nuclear Free Sierra Club and involved in a lot of trying to establish that we have enough energy from renewable sources. We don't need all this. But my comment was, have fears today of disaster compared to the time when all these movies came out, have fears diminished? And I sort of think so. I also think the opposite, that there's so many fears of so many types of disasters. I mean, you name it, climate change, the Trump administration, democracy, the wars, that we don't know what to do. We're all numb. But what I didn't notice was that the coming to reality about nuclear disaster was a big from these films that you all mentioned, which were earlier. Have they diminished now? And any comments on what I said? Thank you.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, and it has really struck me. I've been sort of looking at nuclear issues, more really nuclear power than nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons was sort of my entry into looking at nuclear issues. I went to Hiroshima in 2004, so I've been kind of looking at nuclear things, I guess, for about a couple of decades now, and in that time, really, until I suppose Oppenheimer, maybe a couple of years ago. It was quite striking how little there was, not just in movies, but just in general. When I was researching my documentary, I had to go back and read books from the 70s and 80s. There were a few kind of, I guess, like pop science books about nuclear power, but there just was not anything on the same level of cultural discussion around nuclear issues altogether, has been my experience. I don't know if Allison or Min, you want to chip in.
Well, let me just say, I think the population has become numb to disasters.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead, please.
I think the numbness is an interesting. I don't really know how I feel about it, because I was born in 1998, and like sort of the Cold War is something I learned about, not lived, through like talking about it with my parents who grew up in Korea. But I think for me, like, it was actually being Korean and obviously having North Korea on the doorsteps of South Korea, and like the news of nuclear weapons, which kind of alerted me to it as a young person. So I was kind of always like kind of aware of it. When I first moved to the UK in the summer of 2003, there was a lot of talk about weapons of mass destruction, which were like, again, like very kind of like, I do wonder if, there's this, I think there's an idea that sort of everyone born after the Cold War isn't as sort of mindful about nuclear weapons, and that might not necessarily be the case, because I think there's been enough geopolitics for us to sort of be aware of them on the horizon. But then the sort of the more important point I wanted to make was, regardless of numbness, I think we're more vulnerable now than ever. And I say that, and I'll take a quick detour, which is, before Threads was rebroadcast on British televisions, it was actually in the news because Mark Zuckerberg obviously named his social media app Threads, and it's this kind of crazy serendipity that Mark Zuckerberg named an app whose name raises a very different set of connotations in Britain, of course. But I kind of wanted to sit with that serendipity because, you know, at least in the day after on Threads, people still use like physical media. People still have like people like write journals and stuff. But my generation, like every communication that we rely on, including this Zoom call, is reliant on digital technologies. So I wondered if an EMP went off, as they do in each of these films, every single one of my photos on the iCloud is forever gone. Like every single photo I've ever taken since I was a 13-year-old getting an iPhone, right? And I do think that the sort of the digitization of the archive, and kind of our increasing reliance on technology has, if anything, only made us more vulnerable and precarious to the kind of the consequences of nuclear war. So if we're numb to it, then certainly we shouldn't be. And my generation needs to kind of, get a kick up the bum if we think we've sort of, thought our way out of it. But no, I for one, am certainly not numb to the threats.
Yeah, I would agree with what Min's saying. I'm glad that, Min, you brought up the doomsday clock. I was going to do that as well, but that I think is really important, right? There is so much that's precarious right now. There are so many things where I think that people, I mean, in the US in the last 50 years, I mean, things weren't great for a lot of people in the 80s. They were terrible, and Reagan made them worse. But at the same time, things have gotten worse, right? There is more concern about every day, being able to live every day, being able to have shelter, being able to have food, being able to have healthcare. I mean, all of these things, right? So, and I think coverage of those things to a degree than there was in the past. But I agree about the archive. And one of the things that I was thinking, I always think about with digitization of the archive, things are going to disappear. And I think we see that since the Trump administration, archives are disappearing. They're taking them down. There's a lot of activism around actually preserving and downloading things before they disappear, because they are disappearing. And we have where is the history, right? It's not going to exist. And to sort of carry it back to war games, and what we're dealing with is, teenagers in the halls of power who are pressing the wrong button. And that could be the end of the world. We have this constant security leaking. We have the fact that they've shut down cybersecurity completely, which is flabbergasting. So I do feel, to Stephen's point, I feel more actively scared to death, I think, on a day-to-day basis right now. So that's what I'll say.
Yuki, I don't think you need to raise your hand, but
Thank you. I would like to hear more from the audience, but meanwhile, my question is that, yes, there is some numbness, and it has to do with this numbness, but at the same time, I'm not sure about British English, but in the United States, we often use nuke in a very casual way, like nuke it to use the microwave oven. Or nowadays, I think nuke it means like terminate it, finish it, right? So I just wonder this, not quite disparity, but this casualness of the use of the word and this horror or threat. Like this was like I think going on since the 50s, right? On the one hand, this is a very scary weapon, new kind of weapon, but on the other hand, we are trying to domesticate it, associating it with women's images. So I wonder if both Min and Allison can talk about that kind of images and representations.
We probably have to make this the last comment as well. I've just seen we're hurtling towards the end with so many more things we could talk about. But yeah, if you guys want to just pick up on that, and then I can wrap up.
Keep it brief and just say that that kind of wordplay, that kind of deferral of meaning, I think has been with the nuclear since its very inception. And one of the chapters in my thesis that I look at is Bikini Atoll and American nuclear test of Bikini Atoll, and the fact that if you look up the word bikini now, you obviously get women's swimsuits and not the name of the atolls of the Americans tested 67 nuclear bombs. So this kind of like wordplay has always been used to conceal like America or sort of wider nuclear necropolitics. And in terms of, and I'm working on the sort of the image level, the mushroom cloud is something that is so benign now. Even the word mushroom, to kind of to bring it into the realm of nature is itself kind of this sort of naturalizing effect. So yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of there's a lot of wordplay and a lot of kind of digging to the original source that we need to do in this work.
Yeah, I would just say I agree with Min. So I think we do that with a lot of language that causes us anxiety, right? So we see the word lame, we see the word gay, we see that all of these things being used in ways that on some level are defensive, right? For our responsibility regarding nuclear holocaust, our responsibility regarding bias and prejudice against a variety of marginalized groups, right? So it's dealing with that anxiety, I think. But I'll let Vicki to finish up here.
Okay, there was one other, it wasn't really a question, but it's a recommendation in the chat, which I just want to share with everybody. There is a book, I believe it came out last year. Let me go back through it. Annie Jacobsen's Nuclear War. It's on my list. I've not read it yet, but I hear that it's, Jan said here, it was very popular and pulled no punches. And I believe that I read somewhere that somebody is developing a film based on that. And that's good. That's needed. Like I think we want more forums like this. So with that, I mean, it's such a shame we could go on. I'm sure we could go on for another half an hour, but people have got evenings to attend to here in the UK and rest of your day to get to in the States and indeed wherever you are in the world. So I'm going to say a huge thank you, especially to Yuki and Allison and also Anna at DePaul Humanities Centre. This was actually something that originally Min and I were going to try and do something DIY, and we've been so thrilled to be kind of welcomed into the DePaul family for this event. It's been really, really interesting, and they've also very kindly said I could make a little plug. So as mentioned, I'm a filmmaker, and I'm also writing over on Substack currently about nuclear issues and other things and new films. But one of the things I'm going to be doing very soon, probably by the summer, is I'm setting up a film club through my Substack where we will hopefully do something a bit like this. There'll be kind of seasons of themed films, and the first season is going to be on like atomic movies. So I'll like set the movie. Maybe we can vote on what the movies are going to be, but I'll write a kind of intro, and then we can go away, watch the movies, and come back together and have a discussion. So that's going to be like a kind of membership film club that you can sign up to, and I'll be launching that reasonably soon. And as a thank you to everyone for coming to this, I want to offer everybody who's come today like a nice big discount for when I launch. So make sure you've popped your email in the chat if we don't already have it, and when we follow up, I think we should be sending, there's lots of things we can send you from the present. Is it okay to share the presentations Min and Allison, I don't know. Maybe we could pull some things from the presentation, some of the other links, I don't know, but certainly we'll reshare the trailers. I had a couple of questions about where we could watch these films. They are all available online, not necessarily for free. Also, actually, Allison, was it called Special Bulletin? I had not heard of that. I'd love to share that with everybody. So we'll send you a nice big...
I ripped it so I can send it to you.
Fantastic. We'll send you a nice big kind of follow-up with lots of other things you can go away and read more. And if you like chatting about nuclear films, then please do come and join me in the film club. And yeah, I guess with that, it's a very great big thank you to everybody. And yeah, thank you very much. Good evening. Good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody, for putting this together and dealing with all of our technical issues.
Yeah, and thanks for bearing with us with our few snapping. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.